What if a 70-year-old war hero was dragged from a diner in handcuffs, falsely accused by 3 privileged teens, and the entire town turned against him overnight? This is the true story of Elijah Knox, a decorated Army Ranger silenced by lies, until one phone call changed everything. Stick around, what happens next will shock you. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that expose truth, demand justice, and honor our forgotten heroes. At 6:15 on a crisp March morning, Elijah Knox did what he'd done nearly every day for the past 13 years. He walked into Annie Mae's diner just as the first rays of sun cut across the sleepy Tennessee hills. At 70 years old, his gait was slower, more deliberate, but his posture remained impossibly straight-spine like a flagpole. Boots shined, and bronze star pinned discreetly to the inside of his coat, beneath the lapel. He didn't wear it for others. He wore it for the men who never made it home. Annie Mae herself always had his table ready by the window. She called it Elijah's Corner, though no sign marked it. The regulars knew better than to sit there. He was part of the place, just like the cracked linoleum floors. The smell of bacon grease, and the low hum of the radio playing classic country hits from a dusty old speaker by the register. That morning, the diner was mostly empty except for a couple of truckers finishing their coffee and a local teacher grading papers over a half-eaten pancake stack. Elijah ordered his usual black coffee, 2 eggs over medium, rye toast, no butter. He brought a folded newspaper under his arm, same as always, and spread it open on the table, scanning the headlines with eyes that had once peered through the scopes of sniper rifles in Vietnam, and later through the eyes of students in classrooms across Jefferson County. His time in the Army had ended decades ago, but Elijah still carried himself like a man who knew exactly where the exits were. He had survived ambushes in the jungle, bureaucratic indifference back home, and the grief of losing his wife of 43 years. Now, all he wanted was quiet, a good breakfast, a routine. But routine has a way of cracking when privilege walks in wearing varsity jackets and $300 sneakers. At 6:48, the front bell jingled and in walked Chase Radford, Dylan Mercer, and Brooks Whitman, 3 white seniors from Fairview High. Sons of local royalty, a judge, a construction magnate, and the sitting district attorney. Their laughter was loud before the door even shut, their bravado worn like armor. The scent of cheap cologne and last night's beer clung to them like a cloud. They slumped into the booth behind Elijah's without so much as a glance around, already tossing silverware at one another and joking about the geezers in the room. "Yo, what's with Grandpa G.I. Joe over there?" Chase sneered, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Bet he's been nursing that same cup of coffee since Nam." Elijah didn't flinch. He had been insulted by men with rifles in their hands and contempt in their eyes. He'd learned that silence, when deployed properly, could be more commanding than any shouted retort. He turned a page in his paper, took a slow sip of coffee. But the teens weren't done. "Hey, you deaf!" Old Man Dylan laughed. "Or are you just pretending you didn't hear us, Elijah?" Annie Mae called from behind the counter, voice low, trying to keep things calm. "You need anything else?" "Sugar, no thank you." "Annie," Elijah replied calmly, folding his paper and setting it on the table. Then, slowly, and with perfect articulation, he turned toward the boys. "Gentlemen," he said, voice quiet but solid, "I'm just trying to enjoy my breakfast. If you could lower your voices a bit, I'd be grateful." It was not a threat. It was a request, delivered with grace, with dignity, with the patience of a man who had buried too many friends in foreign soil to be rattled by the tantrums of bored, rich boys, but to Chase, Dylan, and Brooks. Being asked especially by a black man old enough to be their grandfather was a challenge to their superiority. Their entitlement had never been questioned before. And now, in front of their peers and waitress Annie Mae, they felt disrespected. Chase stood up suddenly, his chair scraping across the linoleum like a warning. "Did this old dude just threaten us?" he said, raising his voice for show. "You trying to scare us? Huh? We're just kids, and this crazy vet's talking all crazy." Brooks pulled out his phone. Camera already rolling. "This is nuts. Look at him. He's got that psycho vet stare." Elijah didn't move. "I didn't threaten you," he said clearly, calmly. "I asked for quiet. Nothing more." But it was already too late. The scene had been set. The roles assigned. 3 clean-cut white boys in a southern diner, playing the part of innocent victims. 1 old black man in military-style boots and an unreadable face. Perfect villain, within 4 minutes. The sheriff's deputies had arrived, called by a frantic 911 report from Chase claiming an aggressive, unhinged veteran had threatened to kill them. The dispatcher said the words, "trained killer." That was all it took. Deputy Chet Dawson entered the diner with his hand on his weapon, eyes already locked on Elijah. "Sir, get up slowly and place your hands where I can see them," he barked. "I haven't done anything wrong," Elijah replied evenly. "I said, get up, now." Elijah rose carefully. He kept his hands in plain view. He didn't resist, but none of it mattered. In less than a minute, he was face down on the floor, handcuffed with force that made Annie Mae cry out. "Chet. You know him. He's a vet. I know exactly who he is," Dawson muttered, yanking Elijah to his feet like a trophy. "He's dangerous. Outside." The first deputy radioed in. Subject detained. Possible threat neutralized. By 7:20, Elijah Knox was inside a patrol car, watching the town he had called home for 50 years blur past the window like a place he no longer recognized. By 9 o'clock, his mugshot was online. By noon, Channel 6 was running a headline, "Breaking Veteran Arrested for Terror Threat at Local Diner." His photograph was placed next to high school portraits of Chase, Dylan, and Brooks smiling, clean, untouched by reality. The contrast was jarring, intentional, and effective. The town whispered in grocery store aisles. The sheriff gave press conferences, the words unstable, dangerous, trained killer were repeated like gospel. His military career became proof of potential violence. His stoicism became evidence of calculated menace. Nobody wanted to talk about the decades he spent teaching American history at Carver High, or the summer literacy program he ran for underprivileged youth, or the framed photographs in his home, one of his wife, one of his daughter Naomi in her law school graduation gown, and one of him in uniform receiving the Bronze Star under a sun-bleached flag. None of that mattered. The diner never reopened that day. Annie Mae closed early and cried in the back office. She knew what she saw, but, in this town, her word wasn't stronger than Chase Radford's tears. Elijah's breakfast sat untouched on the table, eggs going cold, coffee dark and still. His newspaper remained folded open to a headline that read, "Local veterans to be honored at County Hall next week." He had planned to attend. But by nightfall, The only headline anyone cared about was this veteran terrorizes teens in quiet Tennessee town. And so began the unmaking of Elijah Knox, not by truth, but by accusation, not by guilt, but by fear, not by justice, but by the lie that being a black veteran made him not a hero, but a threat. And yet, this story is far from over, because what happens next will shake everything. So if you believe the truth still matters, like, share, and subscribe, because Elijah's fight has just begun. By the time Elijah Knox sat in the concrete intake room at the Jefferson County Jail, his wrists red from the cuffs. His silence heavy as stone, the boy's lies had already traveled further than his truth ever could. In fact, their version of events was gospel before he even saw a judge. 3 white teenagers, clean-cut, frightened, sons of power, claimed a 70-year-old black man had threatened to kill them in a diner. That was all it took. The machine began spinning. Chase Radford was the first to speak to police. He stood just outside the diner, wrapped in a sheriff's department blanket, like a war survivor, telling reporters that Mr. Knox looked at us like we were targets. His voice cracked on cue. His pale blue eyes shimmered with what looked like tears. He said he could make us disappear, that nobody would find our bodies if we didn't show respect. Not one word of it was true, not even close. But it sounded true. And in a place like Jefferson County, that was enough. What followed was a coordinated performance that only privilege could afford. Within 1 hour, Chase's father, Judge Thomas Radford, had made a call to District Attorney Henry Whitman, who was, coincidentally, the uncle of Brooks Whitman. Whitman called the sheriff, who happened to be an old friend from law school, and just like that, the path of justice was cleared for a narrative built entirely on fabrication. Dylan Mercer added flair during his police interview. He said, "We were soft boys who needed to be educated." He talked about his sniper training. He made this hand gesture like he was aiming a rifle. I was sure he was going to pull a gun. There were no weapons on Elijah, no raised voice, no threats. But Dylan's trembling hands and upper-class diction made it sound as if he'd narrowly escaped death. The officer taking the statement, Deputy Brent Corder, nodded solemnly, never once asking why none of the other patrons corroborated the boy's story. Brooks Whitman's version was the most theatrical. He stared at us like he wanted to snap our necks, he claimed. I felt like I was in a war zone. He told the officer Elijah had whispered something under his breath. I've made kids like you disappear before. When asked if anyone else heard it, Brooks shook his head and replied, he said it just loud enough for me. The specificity made it convincing. It was also completely false. And yet, by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Elijah's name was already being discussed on local AM radio. A Vietnam veteran allegedly made terrorist threats against 3 high school seniors. The host read, authorities are reviewing charges of intent to harm and intimidation. Sources say the man may suffer from PTSD. The story had legs now. No one questioned the source. No one asked for proof. The image of an aging black veteran, broken by war and lashing out at clean-cut white boys, was simply too comfortable a story to discard. No one mentioned that Chase had been suspended the year before for vandalizing school property, or that Dylan had 2 prior citations for underage drinking, or that Brooks had once been pulled over going 90 miles per hour in a 30 zone, only to have the ticket mysteriously disappear. Those records were sealed or quietly removed, thanks to well-placed family connections, but Elijah's military service, his Bronze Star, his spotless civilian record, that somehow wasn't relevant. The sheriff's department issued a brief press release that evening. "We take all threats of violence seriously, especially those involving vulnerable members of our community. The suspect is in custody pending formal charges. We are grateful for the courage shown by the young men who came forward." Vulnerable. That was the word they used to describe 3 boys who had never known real hardship, who had never bled for their country, who had never even held a job. And Elijah Knox, who had crawled through the mud of Laos with bullet fragments in his shoulder, who had taught American civics to underprivileged youth for 2 decades, he was the threat. That night, the local CBS affiliate ran the story under the headline, "Veteran Accused of Threatening Teens in Diner Showdown." The anchor introduced the segment solemnly. Viewers should be aware that this story contains disturbing accounts. The footage cut to Chase, his face blurred, recounting his alleged trauma with trembling hands. No one interviewed Annie Mae. No one asked the cook. No one replayed the surveillance tape from the diner's now conveniently malfunctioning camera system. The effect was chilling and deliberate. The next morning, Sheriff Thomas Crane stood at a podium flanked by deputies and said, "We are treating this case with the utmost seriousness. Mr. Knox is a trained military operative. We have reason to believe he may suffer from psychological conditions related to his combat experience. Until we can determine the full extent of the threat, we're recommending he be held without bail." He cited Elijah's calm demeanor during arrest as evidence of potential detachment from consequences, a wild distortion of the self-control Elijah had spent decades cultivating. In classrooms and locker rooms, the lie became legend. At Fairview High, students began calling Elijah Mad Max. One freshman posted a TikTok skit mocking the event. The post received over 50,000 views in less than 24 hours. Local influencers chimed in with thinly veiled warnings about angry black vets and mental instability. The racial undercurrent wasn't even subtle. It was overt. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in a cell designed for 2, now crammed with 4 men, staring at a blank wall. He said little to the guards, less to his cellmates. The trauma wasn't the jail, it was the betrayal. He had believed in the system. He had risked his life for it. And now, the people sworn to uphold it had already decided he was guilty, not based on evidence, but on assumption. Naomi, his daughter, got the news while in class at Emory Law in Atlanta. She dropped everything. By that evening, she was speeding north on Interstate 75, tears in her eyes, fury in her heart. Her father, the man who raised her on lessons about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, was being held without trial, without testimony, without truth. By the time she arrived in Jefferson County, the narrative had calcified. Elijah Knox was no longer a man. He was a headline, a fear, a weapon for people who had never fought anything real. What made it worse was how little effort the boys needed to destroy him. A few well-placed lies, some family leverage, and a sheriff's department eager to play to public panic. They didn't need evidence, just suggestion, just performance. Because in America, when 3 clean-cut white boys point a finger at a 70-year-old black veteran and say he scared us, the wheels of power move fast and they roll right over the truth. And this was just the beginning. So if you're still with us, share, and subscribe, because what comes next exposes everything. The lies, the cover-up, the reckoning that even privilege couldn't stop. Elijah Knox's truth is not just his own, it's ours too. By the third day of Elijah Knox's confinement, the weight of the accusation had fully settled in, not as disbelief or confusion, but as a bitter, undeniable fact. A 70-year-old Bronze Star recipient, former Army Ranger, and retired civics teacher was being prosecuted in a town where truth bent easily under pressure, and where the word of 3 privileged teenagers drowned out a lifetime of honor. The case against him was already solidifying, not with facts, but with performance. And when Elijah finally met his attorney, that reality hit with brutal clarity. Her name was Layla Granger, and she was young, 27, barely 3 years out of law school, and fresh into the public defender's office after a stint with legal aid in Memphis. She entered the jail's interview room with a stack of papers barely clipped together and eyes that flickered between sympathy and dread. Elijah sat across from her in an orange jumpsuit, hands folded neatly in his lap, posture straight as a salute. He nodded politely. She looked exhausted. "Mr. Knox," she began, "I'm your appointed counsel. I've read the initial reports, and, well, I want to start by saying I'm sorry this is happening." That was the last sincere thing he'd hear in the courtroom for weeks. Layla's caseload was over 100 active clients. She had less than 40 minutes to review Elijah's file before their meeting. Half the pages were duplicates. Key documents were missing. Surveillance footage malfunctioned. Eyewitness statements uncollected. She flipped through the arrest report and winced. "They've charged you with felony terroristic threats and disturbing the peace," she said. "It looks like they're asking for the maximum 10 years. No parole." Elijah said nothing for a moment. Then, softly, "Do they know about my service record?" "They do," she answered. "They're using it." And so began a trial built on sand grain by grain, lie by lie, until a man's entire life was buried beneath it. Judge Royce Henley presided over the Jefferson County Courthouse like a relic from another era. A stout man with a silver mustache and a love of order. Henley had been on the bench for 32 years, and he prided himself on keeping trials efficient. Efficiency, in this case, meant cutting corners. It meant short hearings, tight objections, and an open deference to the prosecution's agenda. When Layla filed her first motion to introduce Elijah's military records, commendations, and teaching history, the judge dismissed it in under 2 minutes. "We are not here to discuss his past accomplishments," Henley ruled. "This court is here to determine whether he posed a threat to 3 young men on March 15th. His Bronze Star is irrelevant to that determination." "But, Your Honor," Layla argued, "the prosecution is using his military background to suggest volatility. We should be allowed to present the truth of that record." Henley shook his head. "Denied. Move on, counselor." That ruling shattered the first wall of the defense, without Elijah's military record. Layla couldn't tell the jury that he'd saved 11 lives in a rescue mission in Kandahar, that he'd trained snipers in ethics and restraint, that he'd earned not just commendations, but respect from every commanding officer he'd ever served under. None of it mattered in Judge Henley's courtroom. The second blow came when Layla called Annie Mae, the diner's owner, as a potential witness. The woman had seen everything: how Elijah had remained calm, how the boys had provoked him, how the police had arrived like they were storming a compound. But when contacted, Annie Mae declined to testify. Her voice, over the phone, had been trembling. "I can't do it." "Layla," she whispered, "I got grandkids. I got a house mortgage. You think they won't come after me?" "Who's they?" Layla asked. "I don't know," Annie replied, "but I know how this town works. Two other witnesses, a cook and a trucker who had been in the diner, both declined as well. One never returned calls. The other said he'd rather not get involved in legal stuff. Layla had only one remaining hope, Naomi Knox, Elijah's daughter. But Judge Henley ruled that Naomi's testimony would be considered character-based and prejudicial, since she had not been present during the incident. Strike 3. Then came District Attorney Franklin Oates, a man with mayoral ambitions, a sculpted jaw, and a smile that could slice paper. Oates built his case not on evidence, but on insinuation. The people of Jefferson County, he began in his opening statement, deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhoods, safe in their own diners, and they cannot feel safe when trained military men, however decorated, begin to see ordinary teenagers as enemies. He pointed directly at Elijah, sitting stoically at the defense table. This is not about Vietnam, Oates continued. This is about what happens when that kind of training is brought into a peaceful community and turned against its youth. He called Chase, Dillon, and Brooks to the stand, one after the other. Each repeated the same rehearsed narrative. Elijah had made vague threats, alluded to violence, mentioned war tactics. None could quote him exactly. None had evidence. But each performed their role with tearful precision. Their suits were well pressed, their hair combed, their voices cracked in just the right moments. It was theater, and the jury bought tickets. Oates then called Dr. Calvin Westridge, a psychologist who had never met Elijah but was presented as an expert in combat trauma. Dr. Westridge testified that older veterans with specialized combat training often exhibit signs of latent aggression, particularly when triggered by perceived disrespect. He cited general studies, never naming Elijah directly, but the message was clear: he was dangerous by definition. Layla objected repeatedly. Each time, Henley overruled. "Counselor," the judge said with growing impatience, "you'll have your turn." When her turn came, Layla's hands trembled. She was smart, committed, and alone. She lacked staff, time, and resources. Her only witness, Elijah himself. He testified with dignity. "I asked them to quiet down," he said plainly. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I've spent my life teaching young people about their rights, not threatening them." But the courtroom had already heard a louder story, wrapped in fear and theatrics. The prosecution rested. The defense had no more witnesses. Layla's closing argument was passionate but thin. "You've heard a story." "Yes," she told the jury, "but not one backed by evidence. You've seen my client, his calm, his record, his discipline. You must ask yourself, do you believe words, or do you believe truth?" It was not enough. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the verdict came guilty on both counts, Elijah didn't flinch. Naomi wept silently behind him. Layla stared at the floor, her hands clenched around her pen. Judge Henley set sentencing for the following week. Elijah was returned to his cell. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters hailed the conviction as a win for community safety. D.A. Oates stood on the steps, smiling. "Today, we reminded Jefferson County that no one is above the law, even decorated veterans. But the law hadn't won. A lie had. And the truth? The truth was buried beneath the rubble of a courtroom built on fear, ambition, and sand. So, if you're still with us, like, share, and subscribe, because what's coming next will shake the very foundations of that courthouse. Elijah Knox's story is far from over, and real justice is just getting started. When the verdict came down guilty on both counts, the air inside Jefferson County Courthouse seemed to freeze. like time itself had been slapped silent. Elijah Knox, Bronze Star recipient, 70 years old, war veteran, educator, father, grandfather, was now legally labeled a threat to public safety. But long before the jury spoke, the real verdict had already been rendered outside the courtroom. It wasn't based on evidence. It wasn't delivered in a courthouse. It was forged in the living rooms of America, on glowing TV screens, in the comment sections of social media, and across kitchen tables where people whispered, "Did you hear what that old man did to those boys?" The media needed a villain, and they chose Elijah with clinical precision. That same afternoon, Channel 6 Action News ran the headline across every screen in town, "Veteran convicted in threat case involving local teens." Beneath it, Elijah's mugshot loomed, lit harshly, shadowed to accentuate lines in his face. Next to it, photos of Chase Radford, Dylan Mercer, and Brooks Whitman smiling in school uniforms, framed in soft lighting with football fields and honor roll certificates behind them. The contrast was deliberate. On one side, youth, innocence, possibility. On the other, age, darkness, danger. Then came the stock footage slow-motion reels of war zones, soldiers ducking behind cover, explosions, tracer rounds lighting up jungles, helicopters lifting wounded men. None of it had anything to do with Elijah, but the implication was unmistakable. The old man in the jumpsuit was a relic of that violence, brutal, unpredictable, and foreign. The narrator's voice was grave. Elijah Knox, a former Army Ranger with sniper training, was found guilty today of making terroristic threats toward 3 local high school students. Authorities are evaluating whether his military background played a role in the incident. They didn't need to say dangerous black man with a gun. The images said it for them. By that evening, the town of Jefferson was divided not by facts, but by fear. Protesters began appearing outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Protect our kids and justice for the Fairview 3. One woman clutched a laminated picture of her son who had graduated with Chase the year before. "We don't hate veterans," she told a local journalist, "but if they've got mental problems from war, they shouldn't be walking around regular people." On Facebook, the comment threads were ablaze. "Bet this isn't the first time he snapped, just the first time he got caught. Why would 3 boys lie? Sounds like PTSD to me. He's a ticking time bomb. Lock him up before someone gets hurt for real. And the worst of them should have been put down in Vietnam. Would have saved everyone the trouble." Even those who had once respected Elijah, former students. Old neighbors began to fall silent. Some were afraid to speak up, afraid they'd be seen as defending violence. Others weren't afraid, they just didn't care enough to risk discomfort. And a few truly believed the lie. After all, wasn't it easier to accept the image on the screen than to question the whole system? Naomi Knox, Elijah's daughter, watched it all unfold with clenched fists and sleepless nights. She had spent her first few days after the trial trying to file emergency appeals, reaching out to national veteran organizations, and writing op-eds that no newspaper agreed to publish. But now, as the media storm intensified, she realized the battle had moved beyond legal filings. This wasn't just about court anymore. It was about perception, and perception was being poisoned. The morning after the verdict, the local paper ran a full-color front-page spread with the headline, "Convicted and Unrepentant, the Veteran Who Terrified Jefferson." The piece quoted anonymous sources inside the jail who said Elijah kept to himself, spoke little, and sometimes stared off into space for long periods of time. "He's cold," One guard supposedly said. "Gives me the creeps." The article never mentioned his 30 years teaching at Carver High. It didn't note the hundreds of kids he helped graduate, the scholarships he raised money for, or the literacy program he ran on Saturdays. It didn't mention the funeral he attended every Memorial Day for fallen soldiers, some of whom had never returned from missions he'd been on. None of that was newsworthy. The headline was, "By the end of the week." Elijah's name had become synonymous with fear. A whisper in Jefferson County schools. A warning in community watch groups. Churches offered prayers for the young men who survived the trauma, while staying silent on the man now locked away. Naomi reached out to local pastors, pleading for a public statement, some sign of support, or at least a call for caution. Most said they were still gathering facts. Others simply didn't respond. Meanwhile, D.A. Franklin Oates, sensing political momentum, doubled down. He gave 3 interviews in 2 days, framing the conviction as part of a broader initiative to protect communities from unpredictable threats. In a town hall streamed live, he said, "We all honor our veterans, but we must also acknowledge when service crosses the line into danger." Elijah Knox may have served our country decades ago, but that doesn't excuse terrifying behavior in a family establishment. The crowd applauded. Oates's approval ratings jumped 10 points in 3 days. And just like that, Elijah Knox, the man who once taught students about the Bill of Rights, who bled for a country that now cast him aside, became a cautionary tale. The internet piled on. TikTok users recreated the diner scene using dramatized audio and slow zooms. One post had over 1 million views in less than 48 hours. Twitter threads debated whether older veterans should be subject to mandatory mental health screenings. Reddit lit up with memes titled, "When Grandpa Goes Rambo." No one questioned the story. They just ran with it. Even Elijah's old friends grew quiet. Mr. Russell, who'd fished with him every summer for a decade, never returned Naomi's calls. Pastor Elijah Jones from Mount Olive Baptist, who'd once called her father a pillar of wisdom, now avoided eye contact in the grocery store. One neighbor crossed the street when Naomi walked past with groceries. "Dad," she whispered during a jail visit, holding his hand through a scratched plastic divider. "I think they're trying to erase you." He gave a faint smile, that same dignified calm he wore like armor. "Then we remind them I was here." But the tide was rising. The lie had taken root. The public didn't just believe Elijah was dangerous. They needed him to be dangerous. Because if he wasn't, then the whole system had to be questioned. If Elijah Knox, veteran and teacher, could be dragged from a diner and thrown into a cell without cause, then what did that say about their justice? It was easier to believe he was guilty. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that the truth was still coming. And when it did, it would shatter everything. So if you believe that truth still has a place in this world, hit like, share, and subscribe, because Elijah Knox's story is far from over. And the reckoning, it's coming. In a quiet dormitory hallway at Emory Law School, Naomi Knox stood alone, phone trembling in her hand, eyes locked on a paused news clip. Her father's mugshot was on screen, grayed out, unsmiling, framed beneath the bold headline, "Convicted Veteran Threatens Teens at Local Diner." The voiceover still rang in her ears. The jury took less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict. That was it. 2 hours to undo 70 years. 2 hours to bury a lifetime of honor. 2 hours to turn her father, Elijah Knox, from veteran to villain in the eyes of the world. Naomi had been in the middle of studying for a constitutional law midterm when the verdict came down. But once she heard the words guilty, terroristic threats, and danger to the community, she knew the exam no longer mattered. Her father didn't need another attorney in a textbook. He needed someone to fight for his name, his legacy, and his truth, someone who knew him not just as a client, but as a man, as her father. By dawn the next morning, Naomi had packed her books, dropped her classes, and left Atlanta behind. The drive to Jefferson County took 4 hours and 17 minutes. With every passing mile, her mind replayed memories like an old film reel, Elijah teaching her how to read on the porch swing with a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, him coaching her debate team in high school, reciting opening statements with the same calm clarity he used in the Army, the way he walked with purpose, spine straight, voice measured even when bills piled up, even when her mother got sick. He had survived combat zones, racism, and grief with dignity. And now he sat in a jail cell because 3 privileged boys decided to lie, and an entire system decided to believe them. When Naomi arrived in town, she expected resistance. She did not expect silence. No one would meet her eyes at the grocery store. The local pastor who once baptized her politely declined a meeting. The teachers at Carver High, where Elijah taught for 30 years, were too busy to talk. Even Annie Mae, the woman who once gave Naomi free hot chocolate every Saturday morning, shut the blinds when she knocked on her door. The message was clear: they had already made up their minds. But Naomi hadn't come to ask for permission. She came to push back. With no money for private counsel and the public defender's office stretched beyond capacity, Naomi took to the one battlefield she could control: the internet. She launched a website that night, justiceforelijah.com. On it, she uploaded photos of her father from his years in uniform, scanned copies of his Bronze Star citation, testimonials from students he had mentored, and a timeline of the diner incident. But it was the video she uploaded the next morning that changed everything. Seated on her childhood porch, Naomi spoke directly into the camera, her voice steady but raw. "My name is Naomi Knox. My father, Elijah Knox, is a decorated war hero, a teacher, and the most honorable man I've ever known. He was falsely accused by 3 boys from powerful families. He never threatened them. He never raised a hand. And now, at 70 years old, he's in jail, branded a terrorist. If this can happen to him, it can happen to anyone." That clip, just 3 minutes and 49 seconds, lit a fuse. By day 3, it had been viewed over 500,000 times. Veteran groups began reaching out, first small organizations, then national ones. A retired Marine named Colton Reyes reposted the video with the caption, "We don't leave our own behind." That single retweet brought in over 80,000 signatures to Naomi's online petition in less than 12 hours. Next came independent journalists, the kind who weren't owned by corporate networks or afraid of small-town political machines. Patricia Santos, a known investigative reporter who had uncovered police corruption in Chicago the year prior, contacted Naomi directly. "I want to hear everything," she said, "and I want the truth." Naomi gave her full-access court transcripts, police reports, the judge's rulings, the DA's press releases. Within 48 hours, Santos published a bombshell article titled "The Silencing of Sergeant Knox." It exposed inconsistencies in the teen boys' testimonies, highlighted the judge's exclusion of Elijah's military service, and included a damning quote from an anonymous courthouse employee. This case was political from the start. They wanted him guilty before the first gavel dropped. Suddenly, the narrative began to shift. Where once Elijah's face had been plastered beside explosions and chaos, now he was framed in sepia-toned photos of him mentoring students and coaching Little League. Clips emerged of him giving Veterans Day speeches in full uniform. One video showed him reading aloud at a public library. Children gathered around his feet. And most powerfully, the public began asking the one question Naomi had screamed into the void for weeks. Why would a man who's lived with dignity for 70 years suddenly turn violent over a cup of coffee? The pressure on local officials began to mount. The district attorney, Franklin Oates, refused interviews. Judge Henley declined to comment. The sheriff's department issued a single, terse statement: "We stand by the original arrest." But behind the scenes, the cracks were spreading, and Naomi wasn't done. She hosted online town halls, Zoom panels with civil rights lawyers, trauma specialists, and veterans who had faced similar discrimination. She wrote op-eds that were finally picked up by The Atlantic and Military Times. Donations poured in from strangers across the country, allowing her to hire a private investigator and begin drafting a motion for retrial. Through it all, Naomi never stopped visiting her father. They spoke through scratched glass, hands pressed to cold plastic. She read him letters from supporters, updated him on petition numbers, told him how people were beginning to see. "I'm proud of you," he'd say each time. "Win or lose. Don't let them break your spirit." And she wouldn't, because Naomi wasn't just defending her father, she was defending the truth. She was proving that one voice, amplified with passion and purpose, could begin to undo even the deepest injustice. She was showing that even in a town that had turned its back on its own hero, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. So if you believe in that kind of fight, if you believe in earned honor, not manufactured fear, then like, share, and subscribe, because Naomi Knox isn't backing down, and the storm she's bringing, it's only just begun. The turning point didn't come with a bang. It came in a manila envelope, hand-delivered to a nondescript office in Atlanta by an anonymous courier, addressed in shaky handwriting to J. Morales, Press. Inside were redacted reports, blurry photos, and one sentence scrawled in pencil on yellow legal paper: "If you want the truth about Elijah Knox, start with the boys and ask Rosa why she's afraid to speak." Jonah Morales, a seasoned investigative reporter with a reputation for peeling back the polished layers of corruption, had been watching the Knox case quietly from the sidelines. At first, he assumed it was another tragic story of race, class, and media distortion. But when Naomi Knox's viral video cut through the fog, something shifted. Jonah, a military brat himself, recognized in Elijah's eyes the look of a man trained for restraint, not chaos, not aggression. That envelope confirmed his instincts. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a cover-up. Jonah dug in. His first stop was Fairview High. He posed as a freelance education researcher. Within 3 days, he'd gathered enough whispers, deleted posts, and classroom rumors to suggest that Chase Radford, Dylan Mercer, and Brooks Whitman weren't the choir boys the media had presented. Through a back-channel contact in the county records office, Jonah secured sealed documents from the school's disciplinary board. What he found was explosive. Chase had been suspended the previous fall for keying a teacher's car after receiving a failing grade. Dylan had been caught cheating on an AP exam. and his family had used their influence to quietly bury the incident. Brooks had 2 internal citations for bullying students of color, including an altercation involving a broken nose. None of this had been brought up during the trial. Not one word. The jury had been fed a narrative of innocence, vulnerability, and trauma. In reality, these boys were entitled storm clouds, used to getting away with anything, because they always had. Jonah wasn't surprised, but he was angry. Next, he turned his attention to the arresting officer, Deputy Wade Larkin. Jonah filed a FOIA request for Larkin's personnel file. What came back was damning. Over a 12-year career, Larkin had accumulated 8 formal complaints for racial bias, 5 of which involved excessive force or unlawful stops, all involving black men under the age of 30. None had led to disciplinary action. One was dismissed because the dashcam footage wasn't available. Another because the complainant relocated out of state. But one case stood out. In 2019, Larkin had detained a black delivery driver named Curtis Womack outside the county courthouse, accusing him of acting suspiciously while unloading packages. Curtis had filed a formal complaint, submitting both a sworn affidavit and a phone video that showed Larkin escalating a peaceful conversation into a physical takedown. Yet, somehow, the case never went to internal review. Jonah reached out to Curtis, now living in Kentucky. Curtis still had the video saved. "I knew I'd need it someday," he told Jonah grimly. "And if Larkin's behind what happened to that vet, I hope this burns it all down." And then came the biggest revelation of all. Jonah went to Annie Mae's diner, the scene of the alleged threat. He asked about the surveillance system, which Naomi had said was mysteriously malfunctioning. A teenage busboy, no more than 16, nervously said, "You should talk to Rosa. She was on shift that morning." Rosa Delgado, the waitress who had been serving Elijah his breakfast when the incident began. Jonah tracked her down in a trailer park just outside town. She opened the door only halfway when he knocked. "I already told the cops everything I know," she said quickly, eyes darting toward the street. Jonah held up his recorder. "And what did they do after that?" She hesitated. Then she said it. "They told me to shut up," according to Rosa, 2 days after Elijah's arrest. She had received a visit from Deputy Larkin and another officer. They came to her home, not the diner. They told her the case was closed, that witnesses weren't needed, and that if she contradicted the official report, there might be consequences. They didn't threaten her outright. But the message was clear. She had 2 kids. No green card, no protection. "I saw the whole thing," Rosa whispered. Elijah never raised his voice. He never moved toward those boys. They were laughing at him, mocking him. And when he asked them to be quiet, they turned on him, like they'd done it before. Jonah asked if she'd testify. She shook her head. Not in this town. Not with that badge walking around like a god. But she agreed to go on record anonymously. And she gave Jonah something else, a copy of the surveillance server access log, printed on diner letterhead. One entry stood out like a siren. March 15th, 12:49 p.m., just hours after the arrest. Remote login by Larkin W. 10 minutes later. The system was rebooted. By the next morning, the footage was gone. Jonah had enough. He compiled it all into a meticulously sourced report titled "The Case Against Elijah Knox Lies." Silence, and a town that protected its own. He published it on a Saturday night. By Sunday morning, it had gone viral. National headlines followed. CNN, The Washington Post, and MSNBC picked up the story. Hashtags exploded, #Justice for Knox. Veteran framed. Larkin lied. Military leaders tweeted their outrage. Elijah's former commanding officer, now retired, wrote an open letter demanding the verdict be overturned. Veteran groups flooded Jefferson County's courthouse phone lines. Naomi, eyes wide, read Jonah's report with trembling hands. She turned to her father that night, visiting him in county lockup. They know now. Daddy, she whispered. They finally know. Elijah looked at her, tired but peaceful. Then we've already won. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. So if you believe the truth, matters like, share, and subscribe, because the walls protecting injustice are starting to crack. And when they fall, the truth won't just be heard. It will roar. On a quiet morning in Arlington, Virginia, General Malcolm Bright, retired four-star general, former head of U.S. Southern Command, sat alone in his study, a steaming mug of black coffee trembling slightly in his weathered hands. The news anchor's voice hummed in the background, something about a wrongfully convicted veteran in Tennessee. He wasn't really listening until the name stopped him cold. Elijah Knox, the anchor said. A decorated Army Ranger turned teacher. Bright slowly turned his gaze to the screen, eyes narrowing. There it was again, Elijah Knox. A name he hadn't spoken in nearly 40 years. And yet, in that instant, the past surged forward like a rising tide. And the memory that followed wasn't blurred or fragmented. It was as sharp as a blade and burned as clear as the sun. Nicaragua, 1984. A covert mission buried deep under Cold War secrecy. Operation Iron Valley. They had been pinned down outside Matagalpa. Bright's unit trapped in a kill zone after intel failed them. 5 Americans, wounded, surrounded by Sandinista forces. Helicopter extraction was a no-go. Artillery couldn't reach them in time. It should have been a massacre. But just before dawn, a single shadow emerged from the jungle, crawling low, moving with precision and silence. It was Sergeant First Class Elijah Knox, with nothing but a suppressed rifle, 2 flashbangs, and nerves made of iron. Elijah dismantled 2 enemy checkpoints, flanked the perimeter, and dragged every man in that unit, Bright included, across a ravine to a secondary evac site. He never asked for thanks, never asked for recognition. And when the dust cleared, Elijah's name vanished into classified reports and sealed transcripts. But Bright never forgot. Now, watching Elijah's mugshot flash across the screen, painted as some unhinged menace, the general's hands clenched the arms of his chair. This wasn't just injustice, it was erasure. And Malcolm Bright had stayed silent long enough. Within 24 hours, he had tracked down Naomi Knox, contacting her through the Justice for Elijah website. She thought it was spam at first, a formal email. Subject line, Urgent Operation Iron Valley. But then she saw the signature, General Malcolm Bright Rett, U.S. Army, 4-star General, retired former commander, U.S. Southern Command. They met the next morning via Zoom. Bright sat ramrod straight, even in retirement, his silver star and service ribbons gleaming behind him on a shelf. Naomi, exhausted but composed, greeted him with cautious curiosity. "I knew your father," Bright said, voice low, steady. "And I'm ashamed to say I let his heroism stay buried for far too long." Naomi blinked. "My father never spoke about Nicaragua. He said he taught civics because it was more useful than his past." Bright nodded. Because he's a man of humility. And because what he did there was sealed under layers of Cold War secrecy. But I pulled the files last night. They've been declassified. And it's time the world knows. He sent Naomi a folder marked DA Files, Iron Valley, Knox. Inside were mission reports, maps, surveillance images, and a signed field memo describing SFC Knox's exceptional bravery under hostile conditions leading to the successful rescue of U.S. personnel. Attached at the end was a typed letter dated July 17, 1984, addressed to then-Pentagon leadership, recommending Elijah Knox for the Medal of Honor. The signature at the bottom, M. Bright. But the recommendation had been stamped denied in red ink, citing mission confidentiality, and filed away in obscurity. Naomi stared at the screen, hand over her mouth. Why didn't you speak up before Bright hesitated? Back then, they told me it would compromise our future operations. I was a rising officer. I did what I was told. But watching your father's dignity be torn to pieces on national television, that was my line. I crossed it in silence. I'm crossing back in truth, with Bright's permission. Naomi uploaded redacted versions of the documents to the Justice for Elijah site, titling the new section, The Hero They Tried to Bury. And then she shared the Medal of Honor letter, in full. It spread like wildfire. Overnight, cable news pivoted. The story was no longer about an unhinged vet. Now it was about a forgotten hero, a man who had risked his life in the shadows of geopolitics to save lives, one of whom had become a general who now stood in his defense. CNN booked Naomi and Bright for a joint interview. Bright, dressed in full military dress blues, stated plainly, Elijah Knox is one of the bravest soldiers I've ever commanded. The government buried his record. The legal system buried his dignity. I will not let history bury his truth. Veterans groups went from outraged to incensed. Congressional representatives began demanding answers about the Medal of Honor oversight. A hashtag emerged, #Honor Elijah Now. Within 48 hours, over 200,000 signatures had been added to a new petition, this one to award Elijah the Medal of Honor posthumously, if necessary. But Naomi wasn't aiming for posthumous. She wanted her father home. And now, for the first time, it felt possible. Even people in Jefferson County began to stir. Some quietly removed their Protect Our Boys signs. Others sent anonymous letters of apology. One local veteran wrote, I served with men like your father. I was wrong to doubt him. I'll never forgive myself if we let this injustice stand. Inside his cell. Elijah read the printed report with slow, careful hands. The paper trembled. His eyes welled, but didn't spill. Malcolm Bright, he murmured, the name like a ghost from the jungle, still standing. Naomi pressed her hand against the glass between them. He says he owes you his life. Elijah smiled, the smallest curl of lip. Funny, I never asked for anything back. But now, without asking, something had finally arrived. Validation, vindication, and maybe, finally, freedom. So if you believe in truth long overdue, if you believe forgotten heroes still deserve their moment of honor, like share and subscribe. Because Elijah Knox's legacy just went from erased to undeniable. On a quiet morning in Arlington, Virginia, General Malcolm Bright, retired 4-star general, former head of U.S. Southern Command, sat alone in his study, a steaming mug of black coffee trembling slightly in his weathered hands. The news anchor's voice hummed in the background, something about a wrongfully convicted veteran in Tennessee. He wasn't really listening until the name stopped him cold. Elijah Knox, the anchor said. A decorated Army Ranger turned teacher. Bright slowly turned his gaze to the screen, eyes narrowing. There it was again, Elijah Knox, a name he hadn't spoken in nearly 40 years. And yet, in that instant, the past surged forward like a rising tide, and the memory that followed wasn't blurred or fragmented. It was as sharp as a blade and burned as clear as the sun. Nicaragua, 1984. A covert mission buried deep under Cold War secrecy. Operation Iron Valley. They had been pinned down outside Matagalpa. Bright's unit trapped in a kill zone after intel failed them. 5 Americans, wounded, surrounded by Sandinista forces. Helicopter extraction was a no-go. Artillery couldn't reach them in time. It should have been a massacre. But just before dawn, a single shadow emerged from the jungle, crawling low, moving with precision and silence. It was Sergeant First Class Elijah Knox, with nothing but a suppressed rifle, 2 flashbangs, and nerves made of iron. Elijah dismantled 2 enemy checkpoints, flanked the perimeter, and dragged every man in that unit, Bright included, across a ravine to a secondary evac site. He never asked for thanks, never asked for recognition. And when the dust cleared, Elijah's name vanished into classified reports and sealed transcripts. But Bright never forgot. Now, watching Elijah's mugshot flash across the screen, painted as some unhinged menace, the general's hands clenched the arms of his chair. This wasn't just injustice, it was erasure. And Malcolm Bright had stayed silent long enough. Within 24 hours, he had tracked down Naomi Knox, contacting her through the Justice for Elijah website. She thought it was spam at first, a formal email. Subject line, Urgent Operation Iron Valley. But then she saw the signature, General Malcolm Bright Retta, U.S. Army, 4-star General, retired former Commander, U.S. Southern Command. They met the next morning via Zoom. Bright sat ramrod straight, even in retirement, his silver star and service ribbons gleaming behind him on a shelf. Naomi, exhausted but composed, greeted him with cautious curiosity. "I knew your father," Bright said, voice low, steady. "And I'm ashamed to say I let his heroism stay buried for far too long." Naomi blinked. "My father never spoke about Nicaragua. He said he taught civics because it was more useful than his past." Bright nodded. "Because he's a man of humility. And because what he did there was sealed under layers of Cold War secrecy, but I pulled the files last night. They've been declassified, and it's time the world knows." He sent Naomi a folder marked DIA Files, Iron Valley, Knox. Inside were mission reports, maps, surveillance images, and a signed field memo describing SFC Knox's exceptional bravery under hostile conditions leading to the successful rescue of U.S. personnel. Attached at the end was a typed letter dated July 17, 1984, addressed to then-Pentagon leadership, recommending Elijah Knox for the Medal of Honor. The signature at the bottom, M. Bright. But the recommendation had been stamped denied in red ink, citing mission confidentiality, and filed away in obscurity. Naomi stared at the screen, hand over her mouth. "Why didn't you speak up before Bright hesitated?" "Back then, they told me it would compromise our future operations. I was a rising officer. I did what I was told. But watching your father's dignity be torn to pieces on national television, that was my line. I crossed it in silence. I'm crossing back, in truth, with Bright's permission." Naomi uploaded redacted versions of the documents to the Justice for Elijah site. titling the new section, "The Hero They Tried to Bury." And then she shared the Medal of Honor letter in full. It spread like wildfire. Overnight, cable news pivoted. The story was no longer about an unhinged vet. Now it was about a forgotten hero. A man who had risked his life in the shadows of geopolitics to save lives, one of whom had become a general who now stood in his defense. CNN booked Naomi and Bright for a joint interview. Bright, dressed in full military dress blues, stated plainly, "Elijah Knox is one of the bravest soldiers I've ever commanded. The government buried his record. The legal system buried his dignity. I will not let history bury his truth." Veterans groups went from outraged to incensed. Congressional representatives began demanding answers about the Medal of Honor oversight. A hashtag emerged, #HonorElijahNow. Within 48 hours, over 200,000 signatures had been added to a new petition, this one, to award Elijah the Medal of Honor posthumously, if necessary. But Naomi wasn't aiming for posthumous. She wanted her father home. And now, for the first time, it felt possible. Even people in Jefferson County began to stir. Some quietly removed their "Protect Our Boys" signs. Others sent anonymous letters of apology. One local veteran wrote, "I served with men like your father. I was wrong to doubt him. I'll never forgive myself if we let this injustice stand." Inside his cell, Elijah read the printed report with slow, careful hands. The paper trembled. His eyes welled, but didn't spill. "Malcolm Bright," he murmured, the name like a ghost from the jungle, still standing. Naomi pressed her hand against the glass between them. "He says he owes you his life." Elijah smiled, the smallest curl of lip. "Funny, I never asked for anything back, but now, without asking." Something had finally arrived. Validation, vindication, and maybe, finally, freedom. So if you believe in truth long overdue, if you believe forgotten heroes still deserve their moment of honor, like, share, and subscribe. Because Elijah Knox's legacy just went from erased to undeniable. It began with a nameplate, polished bronze, simple script, bolted to the marble above the entrance of the once infamous Jefferson County Courthouse. The old name Royce Henley Judicial Complex had been quietly removed under cover of night. In its place, unveiled at sunrise beneath a fluttering American flag, stood a new title, etched in quiet dignity, the Elijah Knox Center for Justice. For a moment, the town stood still. It was the same building where Elijah Knox had once stood accused, misjudged, and condemned. The same walls that had echoed with the prosecutor's lies. The same courtroom where his truth had been buried beneath bias and bureaucracy. And now, it bore his name not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as a symbol. A symbol that justice, even delayed, can still find its voice. In the weeks following his exoneration, Elijah had been flooded with awards, interviews, tributes. His face appeared on murals in Atlanta, on magazine covers in New York, on news tickers from Los Angeles to London. But while the nation elevated him as a symbol of grace under fire, Elijah himself remained grounded. When asked what he planned to do next, his answer was quiet but clear. "I'm going back to work, but not just any work. With the help of Naomi, Jonah Morales, General Bright, and a coalition of lawyers, soldiers, and civil rights advocates, Elijah launched the Knox Initiative for Veterans Justice, a nonprofit legal defense fund dedicated to supporting wrongfully accused service members, especially those from underrepresented communities. The initiative provided legal counsel, investigative resources, and public advocacy for veterans facing unjust charges across the country. Its mission was simple, but radical. No soldier who served their country should stand alone in a courtroom, silenced by the system they once protected. Within 6 months, the Knox Initiative had taken on 27 cases in 12 states. 3 wrongful convictions were overturned. 5 others were under review. Elijah personally wrote letters to each client, often quoting Frederick Douglass or James Baldwin, reminding them that the truth is not a sword, it is a sunrise, and it cannot be held back forever. But Elijah's vision extended beyond courtrooms and legal fights. He returned to Annie Mae's diner, the very place where it all began. The booth where he'd once sat in peace, only to be dragged away in handcuffs, had been preserved under plexiglass. Next to it, a plaque read, "This table bore witness to injustice." Now it serves as a classroom. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, Elijah hosted free history sessions at the diner for local students, veterans, and anyone who wanted to learn. He taught not just names and dates, but truths about America's wars, about civil rights, about silence and resistance. Sometimes he told his own story, not with bitterness, but with purpose. Other times, he handed the floor to others, former inmates, retired teachers, young activists. His class became known as Coffee and Constitution. No tests, no textbooks, just honest conversation over warm mugs and open minds. The first time he stood before a group of teenagers, some of whom were too young to remember his arrest, but old enough to understand what it meant, he opened with this, "They tried to bury me with a lie, but they forgot I was a seed." The kids leaned in, and the town began to heal. Even Rosa Delgado, the waitress who had once feared retaliation, joined the movement. She became the diner's manager and co-founded the Rosa and Knox Fellowship, a scholarship for young people pursuing law and social work. "If he could find the strength to stay standing," she said, "then the least we can do is walk beside him." Over time, even the hardest hearts in Jefferson began to soften. Former skeptics wrote letters of apology. Teachers invited Elijah to speak in their classrooms. One Sunday morning, the pastor who once turned Naomi away called the Knox family to the pulpit and said, with tears in his voice, "We were wrong, but you never stopped believing in what was right." Naomi returned to law school, not just to finish her degree, but to teach part-time at clinics devoted to justice reform. She published her first book, Daughter of the Defendant, What My Father Taught Me About America. It debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list and became required reading at several law schools. As for Elijah, he never sought revenge. He never raised his voice. But his very presence, his calm persistence, changed the trajectory of a nation. Legislators referenced his name during hearings. Civil rights leaders invoked his story in speeches. Young law students cited his case in their dissertations. And across the country, whenever someone asked, "Can one voice really make a difference?" someone else would answer, "Let me tell you about Elijah Knox." The final image in the documentary produced about his life buried truth. The story of Elijah Knox showed him seated at the edge of a creek behind his home, fishing rod in hand, Naomi by his side. The narrator, in a voice as steady as his own, said, "They tried to silence him, but he became a chorus. They tried to erase him, but he became a monument. They tried to bury him, but Elijah Knox grew into something no one could ignore, a man who turned injustice into instruction and pain into purpose." the screen faded to black, and in bold letters appeared one final message: Truth rises. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the darkest corners of our system, light can still break through, like, share, and subscribe. Because the story of Elijah Knox isn't just about one man's redemption. It's about the legacy of change he left behind. And it's a legacy still being written in every courtroom, every classroom, every voice that dares to speak when silence would be safer. Truth, even buried, still rises. The story of Elijah Knox is more than a tale of one man's redemption. It's a mirror held up to the soul of America. It teaches us that justice isn't automatic. It must be fought for, demanded, and protected. Elijah's 70 years of service, silence, and strength were almost erased by a lie. But through truth, courage, and the determined voices of those who refused to look away, his story rose from the ashes and became a beacon for every veteran, every wrongly accused citizen, every daughter who dares to stand alone against the system. This is your reminder: silence can be deadly, but one voice, grounded in truth, can move a nation. Elijah's journey shows us that justice doesn't begin or end in a courtroom. It starts with vigilance in our communities, accountability in our institutions, and empathy in our hearts. His wrongful conviction didn't happen in a vacuum. It was built on apathy, prejudice, and unchecked privilege. But so was his victory built on truth-tellers, digital activism, veteran solidarity, and the unwavering love of a daughter who believed her father's dignity was not up for negotiation. So what can we, as everyday citizens, learn from Elijah's fight? We learn to question the narratives we're fed. We learn to listen before we label. We learn that honoring service means protecting those who served not just in battlefields, but in neighborhoods and courtrooms too. Most of all, we learn that justice delayed may still be justice delivered. If good people refuse to give up, if Elijah's story moved you, if it opened your eyes or stirred your soul, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate the power of truth. Because somewhere in America, right now, there's another Elijah waiting, fighting, hoping, and your voice could be the one that helps them rise. This isn't just a video, it's a call to remember who we are. 330 million people, one fragile promise, and the courage to make it real one story at a time.